Alien Instructor Ridiculed Deathworlders. A human girl silenced the council. The translator chip burned behind my ear before I even stepped off the shuttle ramp. Not a malfunction. Just heat. The way it always felt when it was working too hard, pulling 17 languages apart at once, and feeding me clean audio like everything was normal. It was not normal. Nothing about that moment was normal. I was 19 years old, standing on the docking platform of Verath Station, and the air tasted like copper and recycled ozone, and every creature within 30 meters had stopped moving to look at me. I kept walking. That was the thing about growing up on Earth. You learned early that stopping made you a target. My name is Maya Carter. I grew up in a small city in the north of England, where the winters were long and the summers brief, and the people learned to keep moving, because the alternative was standing still in the cold. My father was a structural engineer. My mother taught secondary school mathematics. Neither of them had ever left Earth. Neither of them had expected to raise a daughter who would. But I had spent 14 of my 19 years reading everything the Galactic Council released about the wider universe. Every accessible public document, every translated cultural record, every data file cleared for civilian download. And when I was 15, I had applied to the Galactic Interspecies Academy on Verath Station. I told my parents it was a school project. It was not a school project. It was the first serious attempt of my life at something I genuinely wanted. The application had taken me 3 months to complete. I sent it and heard nothing for 11 months. For the first 3 of those months, I assumed it was lost. For the next 4, I assumed it had been rejected. For the last 4, I had set it aside and started building a different future. One that was smaller and more reasonable, and did not involve standing 60 light-years from home, with a burning ear and alien eyes moving around me in careful arcs, like water around a stone. Then the confirmation arrived, stamped with the seal of the Council Observer Office, official and cold and real. I sat on the kitchen floor for 20 minutes and did nothing at all. My mother cried. My father read the letter more than once, holding it in both hands, and then he looked at me with an expression I could not fully read. He said, quietly and simply, "Do not let them make you small." I did not understand what he meant at the time. I understood it now. The docking platform of Verath Station was enormous in the way that places designed for 63 species tend to be enormous. The ceilings were so high, they disappeared into atmospheric haze. The floor space accommodated beings whose shoulder height ranged from half a meter to nearly 3. Everything was lit with a pale, even glow that cast no shadows and favored no particular species' visual range. The filtered air was calibrated to biological neutrality and smelled like exactly nothing. The temperature was a compromise that suited no one perfectly and offended no one sufficiently to complain. Other cadets moved around me in careful arcs, dozens of them, from across the galaxy, every shape and color and movement pattern that 40 years of interspecies contact had catalogued. A group of Valorian cadets moved in the smooth, gliding way I recognized from the briefing files, pulled forward by some mechanism I could not identify visually. A Cathari cadet with 6 of its 7 limbs folded into a compact resting configuration consulted a holographic map that floated at my eye level. 2 small, fast creatures moved at the edge of my vision so quickly I kept losing them between blinks. None of them bumped into me. They went around me. Every one. Automatically, politely, the way you navigate around something whose presence you have registered and accounted for, and moved past without particular interest. I had read the welcome documents 3 times on the shuttle. The Academy had been operating for 412 years. 63 recognized species. Acceptance rate approximately 4% across all applicants. In 412 years, it had never admitted a human. I found my assigned quarters without difficulty. Small, clean, filtered air, a sleeping surface, a desk, a light panel, and a narrow window overlooking open space. The stars were very clear. I stood at the window for a few minutes and thought about my father in the kitchen holding the letter. Then I unpacked my bag, arranged my notebooks on the desk in the order I preferred, checked the translator chip calibration by speaking a few test sentences and listening to the playback, and sat down to read through my course timetable. The first week was orientation, course groups organized by declared discipline. I was placed in combat theory, military history, strategic analysis, interspecies conflict resolution, not because I wanted to fight anyone. I had never been in a fight. I intended to keep it that way. But these were the subjects I had studied most seriously at home, and my entrance scores in those areas had been the ones strong enough to carry the application. The other cadets in my group were curious about me. Carefully and precisely curious, in the way of people who have been taught consideration across species boundaries, but are not entirely sure how to apply it to something they have never encountered. A Valorian cadet named Shen Tier introduced himself on the second morning, taller than me by a head, pale silver skin, large dark eyes that blinked sideways. His translator chip calibration was slightly behind mine, and he spoke with the deliberate care of someone working with a tool that lags. He asked where Earth was in relation to the station. I told him. He said he had read that our gravity was quite extreme. I said it depended on where you stood. He seemed to find this genuinely interesting, and asked a follow-up question about whether humans living at different altitudes had measurably different physiologies. I said yes, to a degree. He made a note. Other cadets asked similar questions over those first few days. What Earth food tasted like. Whether humans truly lost consciousness when sleeping. Whether it was true that humans had organized conflict against members of their own species. That last question came from a Kethari cadet named Veloran, asked with innocent directness. I said yes. That was accurate. He was quiet for a moment and then said, "How remarkable. We stopped doing that 11,000 years ago." I said that was very sensible of them. He agreed. Professor Drail's class met for the first time on the 6th day. He was Kethari, the same species as Veloran, but ancient in a way that Veloran was not. 7-limbed, iridescent, moving through the classroom with the ease of someone who has walked this floor so many times, the floor itself knows his weight. His translator chip was embedded in a thin band around his throat, and when he spoke, the audio that arrived in my ear was cultured, precise, and completely without warmth. Not hostile warmth, not the warmth of dislike, the absence of it entirely, the neutral absence of a thermometer that has never been asked to register feeling. He arranged the class in a circular configuration and opened by projecting a large chart onto the wall. It was titled, Civilizational Combat Capability Index, Standard Assessment, 60 species across 4 tiers. The top tier held 4 species, the Kethari among them. The second tier held 11. The third held 22. The fourth, prematurity civilizations, held 23. Humans were listed in that tier, near the bottom of it, above only a species that had achieved orbital flight 17 years ago. I memorized our position on that chart. I memorized the distance between our position and the Kethari's position. I kept my expression calm and completely unremarkable. The Deathworlder classification, Drail said pleasantly, using the galactic shorthand for species from high-gravity, high-competition biospheres, is not a pejorative. I want to be clear about that at the outset. It is a biological designation. Humans are a compelling example of survival-optimized evolution in a challenging environment. They are physically durable. Their tolerance for physical discomfort is genuinely notable. They are persistent, a trait observed across most high-competition biospheres. He paused in the way of a person about to deliver the point the rest has been building toward. However, in terms of strategic history, technological contribution to the wider galaxy, and civilizational maturity, as assessed by the standard framework, the human record is sparse. Their conflicts have been internal. Their technology development has been slow by any comparative measure. Their documented engagement with the galaxy is essentially limited to the last 40 years. By any reasonable measure, humanity is a young civilization, early in its development, and should be understood as such. Nobody disagreed. Several cadets made notes. A Valorian cadet near the front typed something on her terminal. Veloran was looking at his desk. A few cadets looked at me with careful sideways curiosity, registering that the subject of the discussion was present, weighing how to feel about that, and then looked away. Drail moved on to the primary content, a breakdown of 3 major interspecies conflicts from the last 2 centuries, all resolved through Kethari diplomatic frameworks. The analysis was sharp, the sourcing was thorough. He was a good teacher in the technical sense, clear, organized, without flourish. I wrote everything down in my physical notebook. Several cadets watched the pen move with mild interest before returning to their terminals. At the end of class, Drail asked if anyone had questions about the covered material. I raised my hand. He saw it. His attention arrived at my raised hand and noted it. He held that note for 11 seconds. I counted in my head, quietly and precisely. Then he said, "We appear to be out of time. We will continue next session." He gathered his materials with the calm efficiency of a man who has done this for decades and finds it satisfying in its routine. The room began to empty. I put my hand down. I opened my notebook to the clean margin at the bottom of that day's notes and wrote one line. Why? Just that. The question, sitting alone at the bottom of the page, while the room emptied around me, and the projector dimmed and the stars went on being clear and still, beyond the window at the end of the corridor outside. I stayed in my seat until the room was completely empty. Then I opened my data terminal and navigated to the Galactic Council's public database on registered species. I found the human entry. 18 pages. I sat with that number. The Cathari entry ran to 467 pages with 3 annexes and a supplementary bibliography. The Valorian entry was 212 pages. The species that had achieved orbital flight 17 years ago had a 40-page entry, most of it speculative projection. 18 pages for humanity. I read all 18. Most of it was biological classification, atmospheric requirements, nutritional data, estimated population. The history section was 6 pages. The military history section was 1 page, half of which was a note explaining that full historical records for this species were limited and that available data should be considered preliminary. At the very bottom of that page, below the footnotes, in print small enough that most readers would not reach it, there was a notation. Certain historical records pertaining to this species are classified under Council Resolution 7 Delta, issued in the 2nd year of the current administrative period. Requests for access to restricted materials must be directed to the 9th Stacks Archive, subject to faculty authorization. I read that sentence 5 times. Then I wrote a second line in my notebook, below the first. Not if I can help it. I closed the terminal. I looked out the window at the stars. I thought about my father standing in the kitchen, choosing those particular words out of everything he could have said. I picked up my bag. I picked up my notebook. I went to find the 9th Stacks Archive. The 9th Stacks Archive was in the deepest section of the Academy's library system, not the open main library but the physical archive below it, where documents too old or too sensitive for the network were kept in sealed atmospheric containers that held the precise conditions of the moment of their creation. 3 separate staff members directed me to 3 separate other staff members before I found the right path. The third one pointed me to a staircase I had walked past 4 times and said, "Third door on the left. Knock twice. She does not always hear the first knock." I knocked twice. Dr. Oswell was 314 years old, and she wore those years the way very old libraries wear their age, in the quality of stillness that comes from having held many things for a very long time. She was Rendasi, built long and thin, with 4 arms in 2 pairs at different heights, and eyes the deep amber color of old data crystals. Her desk was buried under physical objects, printed documents, rows of data chips organized in a system only she understood, a collection of small personal objects whose purpose I did not ask about. The room smelled of sealed air and preservation compounds, and faintly of something I could not identify, but which reminded me of very cold water. "You are the human cadet," she said, not a question. "My name is Maya Carter," I said. "I know your name," she said. "Sit down." I sat. The chair was sized for a Rendasi and slightly too high for me. I adjusted without comment. She studied me with those amber eyes, the patient attention of someone reading a document in a language they know well, but did not grow up speaking. Then she folded 2 of her 4 arms and said, "You found the notation in the species file." I had not mentioned it. "Yes," I said. "Good," she said. "I have been waiting 18 years for someone to find it. You are the first to come here because of it." She picked up one of the data chips and turned it between her fingers, a habit I would come to know well. Most people do not read the footnotes. "I read everything," I said. She set the chip down and looked at me again with that measuring attention. "Tell me what you found," she said. I told her all of it, the notation, the restricted classification, the 18 pages against the Cathari's 467, the 1-page military history that read like a summary of a summary, with most of the original removed. I told her about the ranking chart on Drail's wall, and the bottom tier, and the way the gap in the data had been presented as evidence of what the data would say if it existed. She listened without interrupting once. When I finished, the room was quiet, except for the low hum of the preservation systems. "Council Resolution 7 Delta was issued 203 years ago," she said. "It was authored jointly by the founding 3 administrative species. The public justification stated data reliability, the position that records from pre-contact civilizations could not be verified to Council standards, and should be withheld pending a formal review. She was not turning the chip anymore. That review was formally scheduled to occur 15 years after the resolution was passed. It was never completed. It was postponed 3 times. Then the scheduling was removed from the administrative record entirely. I felt the quiet settle of something becoming certain. What was the real reason? I asked. I cannot show you the internal council deliberations from that period, she said carefully. Those are separately restricted. What I can tell you is what the restricted records themselves contain, the actual historical documents about humanity that were sealed away. I can tell you this because as senior archivist, I have clearance to access those materials, and I can tell you that I have read them over the course of my career, and I find myself increasingly certain that they should not be restricted at all. She reached into her lower desk drawer with one of her lower arms and placed a small dark data chip on the surface between us. You cannot remove this. What I can do is authorize you to review the contents in the restricted reading room under my faculty supervision, which satisfies the access conditions of Resolution 7 Delta. The regulation requires faculty authorization. It does not specify that the authorizing faculty member must be the cadet's own instructor. I looked at the chip. That is a loophole, I said. Yes, she said. I have been aware of it for some time. Why not use it yourself? I asked. Publish the findings? Write the report the review never produced? She was quiet for a moment, and the quiet had the weight of someone who has considered this question carefully and arrived at peace with the answer. Because I am an archivist, she said. My function is to preserve and to provide access. I hold the record. It is not my role to argue the case. The argument requires someone with standing, someone who can put it before a body with the authority to act on it, in a formal context where it cannot simply be set aside as one person's professional opinion. She looked at me steadily. A cadet presenting original research at a formal academic assessment, before a live panel of council observers, that person has standing. The argument made in that setting cannot simply be filed away. The grand assessment. I had read about it in the welcome documents, once per academic year. Formal presentation before a live council panel, class rankings and fellowship nominations decided there. When does it take place? I asked, though I already knew. 6 weeks from today, she said. I looked at the chip on the desk between us. 6 weeks. I ran the arithmetic in my head. The depth of the archive, the scope of what I needed to build, the time required to map restricted documents against the council's own published assessment framework, cross-reference and source everything, build an argument that could not be set aside by a panel of people who had heard 6,000 presentations between them. 6 weeks was tight. It was not impossible. I need to understand the council's methodology completely, I said. The framework they use to produce tier rankings, every criterion, every scoring level. All of it is in the open record, she said, published in full 22 years ago. Good, I said. I am going to run humanity through it. The real version of humanity, with the full data. She stood, a process that took a moment and involved 2 of her lower arms bracing against the desk, and said, Come, I will show you the restricted reading room. You can begin today. I followed her through a narrow door at the back of the office, into a small room with 4 reading terminals, no windows, and the specific quality of quiet that exists only in rooms where very important things have been kept undisturbed for a very long time. I sat at the nearest terminal. 6 weeks. I opened the first file. I began. What I found in the restricted archive was not what I had expected. I had expected gaps to be filled, some history where the public record said there was little, some documentation of strategic capability that the tier ranking had overlooked. I was not prepared for an entirely different picture. The restricted files were comprehensive in a way the 18-page public entry was not. Council-sanctioned researchers had spent decades gathering them before the restriction, and the care and thoroughness of their work was evident on every page. And what that work showed was not a small correction to the available assessment. It was evidence of a civilization the Council's researchers had found genuinely difficult to categorize, not because we were powerful by galactic standards, but because we displayed patterns that their standard categories were not built to measure cleanly. One of those researchers had written, in the margin of a report dated 190 years ago, in careful measured language, the phrase, anomalous strategic adaptability. The note had never been included in any published document. Adaptability. The capacity to change strategy in real time under unanticipated conditions. Coalition formation with former adversaries. Recovery and reorganization after catastrophic loss, within the same conflict cycle rather than after a generational pause. Long-range strategic objectives maintained across changes in leadership, changes in resource base, changes in the fundamental nature of the threat itself. These were the patterns the restricted documents traced across centuries of human history, not gloriously, not simply, but thoroughly, in the honest and complicated way of researchers who are documenting what they find, rather than what they expected to find. The Galactic Council's 7-category framework for civilizational strategic assessment was designed to measure exactly these qualities. The researchers who had gathered these documents had been applying that framework honestly. Their results were in the archive. The numbers did not match what was in the public record. I copied every source citation. I mapped every restricted document to its open record equivalent, and identified precisely where the public version had been shortened, where a paragraph had become a sentence, where a sentence had become a data point, where context had been removed until only the thinnest version of the record remained. Meanwhile, Drail's class continued 3 times each week. He referred to human strategic limitations in passing 3 more times during those first weeks. Each time the reference was brief, factual by his understanding of the facts, delivered in the tone of a person stating what is established and well known, the tone of certainty that comes from having read the same conclusion in enough places that the conclusion no longer seems like a conclusion. It simply seems like the shape of things. I wrote everything down. I said nothing. I kept going back to the archive. The incident that changed the immediate shape of things happened in the 7th week of term. Drail announced a formal presentation exercise. Every cadet would present their homeworld's most significant military achievement. 20% of the term grade. He distributed the presentation order. My name was on the list. I prepared carefully. I chose a conflict from the open human historical record, framed it within the Council's standard rubric, sourced everything from the public database. I was not going to reveal the restricted materials in a classroom assignment. I needed the full argument intact for the grand assessment, but I could make a solid presentation from the public record if I was precise about what it actually said, versus what Drail's summary implied it said. The day came. I watched 11 cadets present. Each spoke about something their species was proud of, and the room was attentive and warm in the particular way of an audience that recognizes itself in what it is hearing. The Cathari cadet spoke for 12 minutes about a diplomatic resolution that had prevented a war between 4 systems, and the class was rapt. Shentir spoke about a Valorian defensive engagement with the careful pride of someone who has studied something deeply. Valoran presented a resource-sharing agreement between Cathari governments during a period of severe scarcity, and Drail accepted it as an example of civilizational coordination, which was fair. Even the smallest cadet in the group, a member of a species I was still learning, described an act of collective defense that had preserved their homeworld, and when they sat down, Shentir touched their arm in the Valorian gesture of recognition. Then the order arrived at my name. I rose. "I think we will skip the Deathworlders entry today," Drail said. "Pleasant, efficient, brisk. We are running close to time, and the human strategic record does not offer material that hasn't been covered in our general discussions. We will move directly to the closing analysis." He was already looking at his notes. He was already past the moment. I stood for 1 full second. Then I sat down. Nobody objected. Valoran looked at the floor. Shentir glanced at me quickly and away. The session closed around the gap without pause, the way water closes behind a stone, leaving no mark. After the session, I sat in my seat until the room was empty. I opened my notebook to the page with 2 lines on it. I read both. Then I wrote a third. 6 weeks. I closed the notebook and went back to the archive. The Grand Assessment Petition mechanism was in the Academy's administrative code. Shentir found it 5 days after the presentation session, going through the regulations document by document, with the methodical patience of someone who has decided something is wrong and is looking for the correct way to address it. He brought it to me in the corridor with the precision of a person who has rehearsed an explanation and wants it to land clearly. An independent petition slot existed for cadets not selected to the departmental shortlist. It required a formal written application to the Academic Council office and sponsorship from a faculty member outside the nominating department. The application needed a thesis outline and a stated argument for why the work merited independent consideration. If the sponsorship was valid and the application complete, the slot was granted, no discretionary element. The regulation was either satisfied or it was not. 4 cases in the Academy's history. All 4 upheld. 3 other cadets had helped Shentier research this. Valoran was one of them. 2 cadets from Applied Engineering were the others. They had been watching the situation, Shentier told me, and had described it among themselves as procedurally incorrect. I need faculty sponsorship from outside combat theory, I said. Yes, he said. I know exactly who to ask, I said. I went to the archive that afternoon. Osvel read the petition regulation once, carefully. She looked at me. You will use the council's own framework, she said. Yes, I said. Applied to the full record. Every restricted source cited by registration number. Yes, I said. She picked up her pen. She signed the sponsorship line with the precise, unhurried hand of someone who has been waiting to make exactly this mark. She handed the form back. Be accurate, she said. Not just thorough. Accuracy is the right information in the right place, for the right purpose. Thoroughness is just quantity. I know, I said. And do not make it personal, she said. Your argument is with the data. Let the data carry the weight. You carry only the clarity. I understand, I said. Good, she said, and returned to her work. You have 4 weeks. Use every one of them. I submitted the petition the next morning. Confirmation arrived 3 days later. Petition approved. Independent slot granted. Final position in the assessment day program. Last slot. Cleanup position. Graveyard of the schedule. I was not troubled by this. A room that has been listening for 6 hours, with a panel that has moved past the need to be impressed by surface and has cleared into something more honest. That was not necessarily a bad room to walk into. I would work with what I was given. I always had. 4 weeks. I built the thesis with the focused attention of someone for whom stopping is not an available option, which is what I had been trained to be by the particular conditions of the planet I came from and the 19 years I had lived on it. The council's framework was 7 categories. I had memorized it. I applied it honestly to 6 human historical periods, drawn from the full restricted record, cross-referencing every restricted document to its access registration number, mapping every citation in a chain that could be verified step by step. The argument was not that humans were greater than the ranking said. It was not an appeal. It was a methodological audit. The same framework, the same criteria, the same scoring standards, applied to the complete data rather than the edited version. The results were different, significantly different. Across all 7 categories, with the full record, the scores were higher than the published numbers. In 3 of the 7 categories, they were dramatically higher. Those 3 categories were coalition formation with former adversaries, recovery and reorganization after catastrophic loss, and long-range strategic planning across changes in leadership, precisely the areas where human history was richest and the restricted archive most densely documented. The published ranking was not a scientific conclusion. It was an artifact. I could demonstrate that, source by source, score by score. In the 3rd week, Drayle came to the archive late in the evening. I was at the reading terminal when I heard the door. I looked up. He was standing in the entrance to the restricted room in his formal faculty robes, and he was looking at the wall of organized notes beside my terminal. I heard your petition was accepted, he said. Yes, I said. He came into the room and stood across the terminal from me. He did not look at the access logs, but he was aware of them. I want to suggest that you consider withdrawing, he said. His voice was the same as always, measured, calm, without hostility. The panel includes Elder Mav Surret, 31 years of council assessment experience. The other 4 observers are equally senior. A presentation before this panel requires complete command of methodology and sourcing. Any gap in the evidence chain is identified immediately. He paused. Your focus, the human strategic record, is one I know well. I am telling you, as directly as I can, that the evidence base does not support the kind of argument I believe you are attempting. I looked at him steadily. Thank you for coming to speak with me in person, I said. I meant it. He waited. I will not be withdrawing, I said. He was quiet. His attention moved briefly to the data chips beside the terminal, then to the access log, then back to me. Something shifted slightly in his expression. Not concern, but the very beginning of something that was not certainty. Oswell's authorization covers restricted access, he said. Not quite a question. Yes, I said. A longer pause. Prepare well, he said. Then, the panel will challenge you significantly. I am counting on it, I said. He looked at me once more, then he left. I turned back to the terminal and kept working. The night before the assessment, I slept 6 hours, which was more than I expected. When I woke, I lay still in the dark and went through the entire thesis in my head. All 7 categories, all 6 case studies, every citation in order, every challenge point I anticipated, and my prepared response to each. It took 40 minutes. Everything was exactly where I had put it. I got up, I dressed, I ate. I picked up my notebook and my terminal and my bag. At the window of my small room, I looked at the stars for exactly 1 minute. The same stars as the first night, unchanged. Then I went to the hall. The main assembly hall on Verath Station held 400, and every seat was filled when I arrived. Faculty in the upper tiers, cadets in the concentric arcs below, administrative staff along the back walls, and at the elevated panel desk at the front. The 5 Galactic Council observers arranged behind their long, curved surface of dark, polished material that reflected the room's light back in flat, clean lines. I found my seat and looked at the panel. Elder Mav Surret was at the center. Cathari, like Drael, but nothing else about her resembled him. Where Drael was fluid and composed, Mav Surret had the quality of compression, small and dense with held attention, her iridescent surface worn by decades of use rather than kept for display. 7 limbs in the resting arrangement of someone who is never fully resting. She was reading something on a tablet and did not look up as 400 people filled the room around her. She had the absolute stillness of someone who has been in enough rooms to know exactly what is happening in this one without checking. The 4 observers to her left and right were similarly still. A Valorian elder at the far left, 3 other species I had studied in my preparation files. All of them senior, all of them carrying the calm of people who have been doing important things for a long time and have arrived at the steadiness that follows. The presentations began at the start of the session and ran in departmental order. I watched all 11. They were genuinely good, prepared for months, argued with precision, delivered with confidence. Several were challenged sharply by the panel and held their ground. One second-year cadet from the engineering cohort responded to a methodology challenge with an answer so precisely accurate that the Valorian observer made a visible notation. That cadet would receive a fellowship nomination. They deserved it. Drael was in the front row of the faculty section, composed, professionally attentive, watching his department's cadets with the focused satisfaction of a teacher observing students do something they have been well prepared to do. When Veloran presented a careful analysis of the long-term strategic effects of a Cathari diplomatic intervention in a historic 3-system conflict, Drael's posture shifted forward slightly, the particular lean of a teacher recognizing work done well. I watched it all. I sat still and drank water and reviewed nothing, because there was nothing left to review. The work was complete. It was either sufficient or it was not, and I would find out shortly. At the end of the 11th presentation, there was a brief recess. The hall noise rose. People stretched. I stayed in my seat. The moderator's voice returned. She called the final name. I walked to the center of the floor. The room shifted, not loudly, but 400 people who had been watching 11 familiar, expected things now watched something unexpected occupy the floor, and the quality of attention changed in the particular way it does when a room encounters something it has not yet filed under a known category. I felt that shift arrive, and I used it. I did not wait for the room to settle and convert its alertness into passive anticipation. I spoke immediately. Before I present my thesis, I said, I want to ask the panel a question. My voice was level. The hall acoustics were excellent, and the translator chips ensured clarity. I want to ask how the Galactic Council defines civilizational military maturity. Specifically, I would like the panel to state the definition used in the standard formal assessment. Not my definition, the Council's definition, as it appears in the framework document. A brief silence. 2 seconds, perhaps slightly more. In a room of 400 people who had been listening for hours, those 2 seconds were audible. Elder Mav Surret looked up from her tablet. She looked at me with the attention of someone applying a very precise instrument to a surface, careful, unhurried, measuring something specific. The definition, she said, is contained in the 7-category Standard Strategic Assessment Framework, published in its current form 22 years ago. It is in the public record. Yes, I said. Thank you. That is the framework I am going to use. I activated the display behind me. The first slide, a plain header listing the 7 categories, sourced to the Council's own published document, with the exact publication reference number. The subject of my thesis is the human civilization, I said. The data source is the full historical record, including materials currently classified under Council Resolution 7 Delta and accessed under faculty authorization from the 9th Stacks Archive. For every restricted source I cite, I will provide the archive access registration number. Every source I use today can be verified by this panel against the archive registration logs in real time, if any member wishes to do so. The room was very quiet. I advanced to the first case study. 6 human historical periods, each one selected to correspond to a different cluster of the assessment categories. The first was a multi-decade conflict from several centuries ago, resolved not by the elimination of either party, but by the construction of a diplomatic economic framework that had substantially outlasted both original parties. The full documentation of that process was in the restricted archive, the coalition building across 17 separate agreements, the resource-sharing negotiations that had held together under conditions designed to tear them apart, the strategic continuity maintained across 4 complete leadership transitions on each side. The public record contained 2 sentences. I walked through each assessment category against the documented evidence. My voice stayed level. The data was on the display, sourced, accessible, clearly organized. I was not performing certainty. I was showing the panel exactly where each number came from, and how it had been produced, the way an engineer shows their work when the calculation is too important to take on trust alone. By the third case study, the quality of the silence in the room had changed. Not louder, quieter, actually. The specific quiet of people who have stopped wondering what comes next, because what is happening now has all of their attention. By the 5th, I looked up from the display and saw that Elder Mav Surratt's tablet was flat on the desk in front of her, and her full attention was on me. 4 eyes, steady and unblinking. 2 of the other observers were leaning slightly forward. The Valorian elder at the far left had his hand raised halfway. The convention for, "I have a point but will hold it," used in Valorian academic settings. By the 6th, Drael's posture in the front row was no longer composed. He was leaning forward with both sets of paired limbs braced against his knees, and his expression had become the expression of a person encountering a calculation that does not match the one they did themselves, and is working out where the difference enters. I finished the 6th case study. I advanced to the synthesis slide. A single comparative chart, the human civilization's full record scores across all 7 categories, placed beside the Council's published scores for 6 other species assessed in the same historical period, using the same methodology. No visual emphasis, no highlighted sections. No graphic elements that could be read as rhetorical rather than analytical. The numbers, clean and sourced, arranged in the plain honesty of a comparison that did not need to be made dramatic because the content was doing all the necessary work. I held the chart on the display for 10 seconds without speaking. Then I said, the Council's own methodology, applied to the complete available data, does not produce the published assessment result. The ranking in the pre-maturity tier is not the outcome of a complete analysis. It is the outcome of an analysis performed on a subset of the data. That subset was not produced by the absence of records. It was produced by the restriction of records that existed, were gathered by Council-sanctioned researchers, were assessed to be analytically valid at the time, and were then removed from public access by administrative resolution. I paused for exactly 2 seconds. The question this raises is not about capability. The question is about how the data became incomplete, and what conclusions derived from incomplete data are worth. Mav Surratt spoke immediately, precise and level, giving nothing away. Your methodology. You are applying the assessment framework to historical materials from a pre-contact civilization. The Council's data reliability standards require verification of primary source authenticity. Address the verification status of your restricted sources. I had prepared for this specifically. I answered specifically, the authentication process the original Council-sanctioned researchers had used, the registration system under which the documents had been archived, The distinction between a document being removed from public access for verified reliability concerns versus a document being removed by administrative resolution for separately stated reasons, and the procedural significance of that distinction. I gave the regulatory reference for each element. Mav Surratt made a notation. The Valorian observer lowered his hand. Your restricted sources. 16 cited. What percentage are primary documents? 83%, I said, without pause. The remaining 17% are secondary analyses written by the original council research team, themselves sourced entirely to individually registered primary documents. The authentication chain is complete and unbroken from primary document to secondary analysis to my citations. He made a notation. A Harath observer spoke next. Slow and deliberate in the way I had learned meant precision rather than hesitation. She asked whether I was implying intent behind the restriction. I was not implying intent. I said this clearly and specifically. The thesis made no claim about the reasoning behind Resolution 7 Delta, because the internal council deliberations that would illuminate that reasoning were separately restricted, and I had not accessed them, and would not speculate about them. What the thesis claimed was a documented factual sequence. Records existed, records were gathered, records were classified. Classification was cited as temporary pending review. Review was never completed. Classification remained. The demonstrable effect of this sequence on published assessments was in the numbers on the chart behind me. The cause of the sequence was a separate question that the thesis did not address. She made a notation. Then Drayle stood. I caught it in my peripheral attention. The tall, iridescent figure rising from the front row with a controlled urgency that was the closest I had ever seen him come to emotion in a professional setting. I want to note, he said, and his voice had the careful grip of someone holding something that is trying to move, that contextualizing restricted materials from a pre-contact civilization requires deep familiarity with civilizational assessment methodology, that a first-year cadet, however capable, cannot reasonably be expected to have fully developed. The thesis may be technically sourced and yet remain analytically insufficient by virtue of... Mav Surratt raised one limb. Drayle stopped mid-sentence. She held the raised limb for 1 second. Then she lowered it. She looked at him, not unkindly, not with hostility, but with the specific look of a very experienced person who has heard a point and found it insufficient, and is now moving past it without drama. Professor Drayle, she said, please be seated. He sat. 400 people said nothing. No one moved. Mav Surratt turned back to me. I have reviewed the sourcing methodology as you have presented it, she said. The access registration numbers are logged and can be confirmed against the 9th stack's records. The authentication chain is as you described. The analytical framework is the council's own published document, applied consistently. She was quiet for a moment. I have one remaining question. It is not a methodology question. You have addressed methodology. Another pause. And in the pause I felt the weight of 31 years of council assessment experience bringing its full attention to bear on a single point. This data has existed for 200 years. The archive access mechanism has been in the administrative code. This thesis could have been constructed by any motivated cadet at any point in the Academy's recent history. Why has it not been? Why now? And why you? 400 people and none of them moved. I looked at her. I considered the right answer. I decided the true answer was the same thing. Because someone decided it was better if people did not know, I said. I said it quietly, without performance, the way you say something you have been certain of for a long time. And when the official record says that a gap in the data is the same as an absence of data worth finding, most people accept the gap. It is much easier to accept the summary than to find the footnote below the footnote and follow it to an archive. And when an academy teaches from the summary, and the summary says a species is not significant, and that species is sitting in the classroom, it is very difficult for that species to argue, because the argument requires access to materials that officially require approval to access, and the natural person to ask for approval is the same person teaching from the summary that the argument is meant to correct. I held her gaze. I found a different way to ask for permission. The hall held 400 people. None of them moved for 5 seconds. I counted. Mav Surratt held my gaze for a long moment, a very long moment. Then she said, "Thank you. The panel will recess." She said it without drama, without signal, in the same level precise tone she had used for every other word she had spoken today. And yet the room, when she said it, made a sound. Not a loud sound, not a disruption, but the collective sound of 400 people exhaling something they had been holding without realizing it. The recess lasted 2 hours and 14 minutes. I sat in a side corridor outside the hall on the floor, my back against the wall, a nutrition bar in my hands. The bar was from my room, packed that morning out of habit. It tasted like compressed grain and artificial fruit flavoring, and it was possibly the best thing I had eaten in my life, because I had been running on concentrated effort for 6 weeks, and my body had very firm opinions about being acknowledged. Shentir arrived within a few minutes of the hall clearing, and sat down beside me. He folded his long Valorian frame into a sitting position, with the efficiency his species had over mine in this, and most other physical respects, and he looked at the opposite wall, and did not say anything for a while. The not saying was exactly right. He understood something that a lot of people do not understand, that there are moments when someone needs company and not conversation, and the ability to know the difference is a kind of intelligence that the Academy's ranking charts do not measure. After several minutes he said, "You told a Galactic Council panel that someone decided they should not know." "Yes," I said. "In the main assembly hall," he said, "with 400 people present." "Yes," I said. He was quiet again. Then, I have been trying to find the right Valorian word for what that moment was. The closest one means the point where a breath that has been held becomes a decision. I think you created one of those. "I hope that is accurate," I said. "I think it is," he said. Osvel arrived about 20 minutes into the recess, moving through the corridor with the careful pace of her 314 years, and her forearms folded in the Rendasi resting position. She sat on my other side. She looked at the opposite wall the way Shentir was looking at it. "Drael stood," she said. "Yes," I said. Mavseret sat him down. "Yes," I said. "Good," she said. We sat in the corridor for the remaining time, and almost none of us said anything, which was exactly what that particular stretch of waiting required. When the moderator's voice came through the corridor speaker, announcing the hall was reconvening, I folded the wrapper of the nutrition bar and put it in my bag. I stood up and straightened my jacket. Shentir and Osvel stood with me. We walked back to the hall together and found our seats. 400 people were still there. Every single one. The hall was as full as it had been before the recess, and this told me something precise and important about what the room had experienced during my presentation. When people stay in their seats through a 2-hour recess at the end of a long day, it is not out of courtesy. It is because they need to know how the next part ends. I sat between Shentir and Osvel, and looked at the elevated panel desk and waited. Mavseret spoke for the panel. She did not use the brief, formal language that assessment closings typically employed, the clean short paragraphs of administrative conclusion. She spoke at length, with the deliberate measured pace of someone who has decided that the reasoning should be heard alongside the conclusion, not withheld from the room in the interest of efficiency. She had, I thought, made a choice about what this moment was for. She was letting 400 people follow the thinking, not just receive the result. She said the thesis had been evaluated during the recess on 3 criteria: methodological rigor, source validity, and analytical integrity. She said that on all 3, the work met or exceeded the standards required for a formal contribution to the Council's academic record. She noted specifically that the use of the Council's own published framework, as the analytical methodology, placed the assessment in a particular position. Any challenge to the analytical conclusions required a challenge to the framework itself, and the framework, as a published and ratified document, could not be challenged without a formal review process. This meant the conclusions, as long as the sourcing held, were structurally protected. The sourcing held. She said the questions raised by the thesis concerning the completeness of the Deathworlder classification files were not questions the panel could answer today. They were not within the panel's authority to resolve. What the panel could do, and was doing, was formally note those questions and forward a notation to the Council Records Office requesting a review of the restriction status of materials covered by Resolution 7 Delta. She was careful about this. She did not promise a particular outcome. She stated precisely what was being done, without decoration. She said the assessment score for the independent thesis was the highest composite score of the current cohort. She said that the panel was nominating Maya Carter, human cadet, first year, for the Council Research Fellowship. She read these things in order, without emphasis or flourish, in the even tone of a person who has arrived at a decision through careful thought and is confident in it, not reluctantly, not dramatically, steadily, with the particular steadiness of someone who knows what they are doing and why. The hall made a sound. Not applause. It was not an applause culture, not for most of the species present, but sound, the collective, unmistakable sound of 400 people absorbing something unexpected and finding that it resolves into something they recognize as correct. The sound of a room arriving somewhere it was always going to arrive, just not on the schedule anyone anticipated. Several faculty members spoke to each other in low voices. Others sat still with the absorbed quality of people processing something that has moved them in a way they are still identifying. Velorin, 2 rows behind me in the cadet section, reached forward and placed 2 fingers briefly on my shoulder in the Cathari formal gesture of recognition between equals. The same gesture I had seen him use in class once, the meaning of which I had looked up the same evening because I wanted to understand every gesture in the room I was sitting in. Shentir beside me was very still, in the way he was still when something had moved him and he was deciding what to do with the feeling. Osvel, on my other side, said nothing at all. She sat with the patience of 314 years, and her expression, when I looked at her, was the expression of a person who has held something in trust for a very long time and has just watched it reach the person it was meant to reach. It was not triumphant, it was not relieved, it was something quieter and more complete than either of those things. After the panel adjourned, and the room began to move and disperse, I found Drayle in the corridor without looking for him. He was standing slightly apart from the main flow of people, in the particular way of someone who is waiting without wanting to make it obvious they are waiting. When I came near, he straightened slightly and turned toward me. "Your methodology was sound," he said. He said it exactly as he said everything, measured, composed, precise. But the composition was different from 6 weeks ago. Different even from this morning in the front row of the hall. It was the composition of a person whose floor has moved beneath him, and who is standing on the new ground, accounting for it. "Thank you," I said. "I will be reviewing the course materials," he said. "Resolution 7 Delta's scope of application to the human historical record is considerably broader than I had understood. The gap in the publicly accessible data is also considerably broader than I had understood. The researchers whose work was classified were not producing unreliable analysis. They were producing inconvenient analysis. Those are different things, and I had not previously been in a position to distinguish between them because I had not previously known the restricted materials existed in the form and volume that they do." He paused. "I want to say, additionally, that the classroom presentation exercise was handled incorrectly by me. I made an assessment based on incomplete data. The same incomplete data I now understand to be incomplete, and I acted on that assessment in a context where the action had a direct effect on you. That is not a methodology error. It is a different kind of error, and I want to acknowledge it." He extended 2 of his 7 limbs toward me in the Cathari formal gesture. I looked at his extended limbs, then I put out my right hand. He looked at it. He did not pretend to recognize the gesture. He looked at it carefully and honestly, the way he looked at things he intended to understand. "It is called a handshake," I said. "It is a human custom. We use it when meeting someone for the first time in a meaningful way, or when acknowledging an agreement or understanding. It means we are not finished, that whatever just happened is a beginning, not an end, that we are going to keep talking." He considered this for a moment. Then he wrapped 2 of his 7 limbs carefully around my hand. The grip was tentative and precise. The grip of someone handling something unfamiliar with deliberate care so as not to get it wrong. "Not finished," he said. "Not finished," I said. He released my hand. He held my gaze for a moment. In those iridescent features, in the small shift that moved across them, I thought I saw something I recognized from my own experience of the last 6 weeks. The expression of a person who has arrived at the edge of something they believed they understood completely, and found that the edge continues beyond the map they were given. He nodded once. I nodded. He moved back into the flow of people in the corridor. I stood in the corridor for a moment alone. Then I walked toward the observation level, and Shen Tir fell into step beside me halfway up the corridor, and we walked side by side without speaking, which was exactly right. We stopped at the long observation corridor with its curved, transparent wall and the open stars beyond it. I stood at the window and looked at them for a long time. They were the same stars I had looked at on my first night in my small room, when everything smelled like nothing, and the future was enormous and uncertain, and I had unpacked my bag and arranged my notebooks in order, and sat at the desk and thought about my father in the kitchen. They were unchanged, and they would be unchanged for longer than anyone on this station would be alive to observe them. They were vast and indifferent, and I found that indifference genuinely comforting in a way that was difficult to explain to people who had not grown up on a planet that taught you, from early childhood, that the universe did not owe you anything, and that you had to build what you needed from what was available. "The fellowship," Shentir said, after a while. "What does it mean in practical terms?" "Research access," I said. "Resource allocation. A formal seat at council-level academic discussions, where policy decisions are made, rather than just where they are announced." I thought about it more precisely. "And time. It means time to do the work that actually needs to be done, rather than fitting the work around a full course schedule in a restricted archive after everyone else has gone to sleep." "The declassification review," he said. "That is the immediate priority," I said. "If the review goes well, the full human historical record goes into the open database. Every institution that uses council materials, every academy, every training program, every educational resource built on the standard framework, updates its records. Drail's course materials change. The tier chart changes. The 18-page entry becomes something that actually reflects what is in the archive." I paused. "That will take time. Council processes are slow, and this one will be more complicated than most, because it involves an institution acknowledging that a 200-year-old restriction was applied in a way that produced misleading conclusions, and institutions find that kind of acknowledgement genuinely difficult." "But you will push," he said. "I will push," I said. He made the small, quick sound that was his laugh, low and brief, barely audible. "You have been pushing since the 6th day of term," he said, "with a notebook and a pen, and a 300-year-old archivist, and 4 weeks of restricted archive access." "She is an excellent archivist," I said. "Yes," he said. "I did some reading about her. She is quite remarkable." I almost smiled. "She would find that description accurate and unremarkable," I said. We stood at the window in the quiet and looked at the stars, and I thought about everything the restricted archive had contained. Not the numbers, not the framework scores, not the analytical conclusions, but the actual substance of what had been documented there. The things people had done under conditions that should not have produced them, the adaptations, the recoveries, the long-sustained efforts that had lasted through changes in leadership and resources, and the fundamental nature of the threats being faced. All of it in a sealed archive, logged and preserved and waiting. I thought about the person who had written Anomalous Strategic Adaptability in a margin 190 years ago and set the document aside to be sealed, and whether they had understood what they were writing, and whether they had been troubled by the sealing, and whether they had thought about it afterward. I thought about Osfel, 314 years old, signing forms and waiting. I thought about my father in the kitchen. I thought about all the people who had built what I stood on and who would never know it. I opened my notebook. 4 lines. I read them in order, slowly, the way you read something you have carried a long distance and want to confirm is still intact. Why? Not if I can help it. 6 weeks. They know now. I held the pen over the page for a moment. The stars were very still. The corridor was quiet around me. Shentir had stepped back slightly to give me the moment, with the particular consideration of someone who understands when a moment belongs only to the person in it. I wrote one more line. We are just starting. I closed the notebook. I put it in my bag. I stood at the window for another minute, not thinking about anything in particular, just standing in the quiet, with the deep, clear, indifferent, brilliant dark beyond the glass, and then I turned and walked back toward the main section of the station. The weeks after the grand assessment moved differently than the weeks before it. Before, everything had a direction, a clear line from where I was to the terminal point of the assessment day, and all of my time and attention had organized itself around that line. After, the line was gone, and in its place was something larger and less defined, the shape of a project that had no single terminal point, that would take years of methodical, patient, sometimes frustrating work, conducted through procedures and review processes and institutional channels, that moved at the pace of organizations that have been operating for centuries and have no particular urgency about anything. I had expected to find that disorienting. Instead, I found it clarifying. The assessment day had been a threshold. I was through it. Now there was the actual work. The fellowship was formally confirmed 8 days after the assessment. The confirmation came from the Council Observer Office in the same format as my original Academy acceptance. Cold, official, exactly real. It allocated research time, archive access, travel authorization to 3 council administrative centers I had not previously had standing to visit, and a modest but sufficient resource stipend. It also allocated me a formal advisor from the council's academic liaison office, a position I had not known existed, held by a Harath senior researcher named Dr. Levitt Oren, who had apparently advised 7 previous fellowship recipients, and whose first communication to me was a document outlining what the fellowship could and could not do, written with the precision of someone who wanted to make sure I understood the boundaries before I began pushing against them. I read the document twice, and then sent her a response, asking 3 specific questions about the review process for Resolution 7 Delta, and whether the panel's notation had been received and formally logged by the Council Records Office. She responded within a day, answering all 3 questions precisely, and without any indication that the pace of my inquiry surprised her. I suspected she had advised enough fellowship recipients to recognize the ones who were going to move quickly. The Council Records review was underway. It had been formally logged 2 days after the assessment, which was faster than I had anticipated. Mav Surratt's panel had apparently submitted the notation the evening of the assessment day itself, rather than waiting for the standard administrative processing window. The review had been assigned to the Restoration and Audit Division of the Council Records Office, a body I had not previously known existed and which, according to the documentation Dr. Levitt Oren sent me, specialized in reviewing historical classification decisions for accuracy and current relevance. I sent a formal research contribution to the division, all of my source citations, the complete mapping of restricted documents to their open record counterparts, and the methodological documentation of the assessment framework analysis. I sent it as a research contribution, not a petition or a complaint, as a piece of organized, verified, systematically presented material that the division could use directly, rather than having to reconstruct from scratch. Dr. Levitt Oren told me, when I mentioned this approach, that it was efficient, and that efficiency in submissions to the Restoration and Audit Division was genuinely appreciated, because they were chronically understaffed and had a backlog of 312 unresolved review cases. 312, I said. Yes, she said. The human file is now 313. However, several factors tend to accelerate the processing of specific cases: the availability of organized, pre-verified source material, the formal notation from a panel of council observers, and the presence of an active fellowship recipient with standing to follow up on the process. She paused in the way she paused when she was about to say something precise. You have all 3 of those factors. Use them. I intended to. In the meantime, there was the academy, and courses, and the ongoing shape of daily life on Verath Station, which continued largely as it had before the assessment, except for certain changes in how I moved through it. The most immediate change was in the combat theory cohort. The day after the assessment, I arrived at the morning session and found the seating configuration subtly different, not dramatically reorganized, not conspicuously altered, but shifted in the small ways that reflect a room recalibrating without wanting to make the recalibration obvious. Vel Oren was sitting to my right rather than 2 seats away. Shen Tir was to my left. Several cadets who had previously treated me with the careful distance of people uncertain about the correct approach now simply sat near me and talked to me the way they talked to each other, without the particular circumspection that had been there before. Drail's class was different in ways that were subtle enough that someone who had not been paying very close attention before the assessment might not have noticed them. He still covered the same material, the same interspecies conflict analyses, the same strategic history, the same framework applications that made up the course's structure, but the way he positioned humans within that material had changed. Not dramatically, not overnight, not as a reversal of everything he had taught, more like a man who has identified an error in his calculations and is working through the implications carefully rather than announcing them. He stopped using us as an example of limitations. He started asking me questions, not in the challenging way of a teacher testing a student, but in the particular way of someone who has encountered a gap in their own knowledge and is addressing it. The first time he asked me a direct question in class, A question about a specific human strategic decision from the period covered in my second case study, which I answered in detail with primary source references. Several cadets in the room looked at each other with the expression of people watching something unexpected occur in a familiar setting. I did not make a point of it. Neither did Drayle. The class moved on, and the next session he asked me another question, and the session after that another, and within 3 weeks, it had become a normal feature of the class in a way that felt, from inside it, as if it had always been possible. Valoran stopped me in the corridor after one of those sessions. He was carrying his terminal under 2 of his arms, and he had the slightly formal posture of someone who has prepared what they want to say. "I want to apologize," he said. I looked at him. "For what specifically?" "For the presentation session," he said. "When Professor Drayle, when your presentation was skipped, I did not say anything. I should have said something. I thought about this honestly. You were a first-year cadet watching your department head make a decision," I said. Speaking up in that moment would have required challenging a senior faculty member in front of the class, with no standing to do so, and no mechanism to back the challenge. I am not certain I would have done it either. "I think you would have," he said. "Maybe," I said, "but I had something specific to argue. You would have been arguing on principle only, with nothing organized yet. That is much harder." I looked at him. "What would help is that you say something the next time you see that kind of moment, with someone else. You have the standing now. You have seen how it goes. Use that." He thought about this seriously, with the specific gravity he brought to everything. "Yes," he said. "I can do that." "Good," I said. He nodded and walked on. I watched him go and thought about how many Valorans there were in every room in every academy. People who knew something was wrong and had no mechanism yet for acting on that knowledge, waiting for the right combination of standing and preparation, and moment to align. The goal was not to be the only person who ever acted. The goal was to change what the room considered normal. 3 months after the assessment, Dr. Levitt-Oren sent me a document from the Restoration and Audit Division. It was not the final determination on Resolution 7 Delta. That would take considerably longer. The timeline estimate was 18 months minimum, 24 probable. But it was the interim status report, and the interim status report noted that the division had completed its initial review of the submitted source materials and had determined that the basis for the original restriction was, in the division's formal language, insufficient to justify ongoing classification under current council standards. This meant the restriction was subject to challenge, and that challenge had merit. It was not the same as the restriction being lifted, but it was the official acknowledgement that the restriction should not have stayed in place indefinitely, and that the data it covered was data the open record needed. That acknowledgement, once formally logged, could not be quietly withdrawn. I sent a copy of the status report to Osvel with a brief note. She sent back a single line, "Well done." Coming from her, that was considerable. Osvel and I met once a week in the archive, continuing the work that the thesis had started. There was more to do than the 6 case studies. Considerably more. The restricted archive contained material on 14 species, of which humans were one, and the methodological problems I had identified in the human assessment were present, in varying degrees, in the assessments of several others. Some of those species were represented at the academy. Some had cadets in the current cohort. I was beginning to understand, slowly, and with the careful attention that Osvel had modeled for me, what the full shape of the problem was, and what the full shape of the solution would need to be. It was larger than I had understood when I was writing the petition. It was going to take longer than 6 weeks. Shen Tir and I talked about this one evening at the end of a long session, sitting in the small common area near the library wing, with the particular exhaustion that comes from a day of concentrated work. He asked how I was finding the scope of the project now that I could see more of it. "Bigger than I thought," I said. "Not more than I expected, more than I initially accounted for." "There is a difference," he said. "Yes," I said. "Expecting something to be large and accounting for it being large are different things. You can expect something indefinitely. Accounting for it requires actually restructuring around it." He thought about this. "Is that difficult?" he asked. "The restructuring." "It is necessary," I said. "That is different from difficult. Things that are necessary have a particular quality. They are easier to commit to than things that are merely important, because they do not offer the option of deciding not to do them." He made the small sound that was his laugh. "You sound like you have been talking to Osvel a lot," he said. "Every week," I said. She is remarkably clarifying. Months passed. The term ended, and a new one began. New cadets arrived at Vereth Station, moving around the platform in careful arcs, looking at everything with the alert attention of people encountering a world they have prepared for, but not yet lived in. I watched them from the observation corridor sometimes, from a position that had not yet become familiar to them, and I thought about what it had felt like to be one of them, and what was different now, and what was the same. What was the same? The translator chip still burned when it worked too hard. The stars were still clear. The work was still the work. Organized, documented, sourced, carried forward step by step in the specific way that the only path through a large problem is step by step with no steps skipped. What was different? I knew the path now. Not all of it. Not the part 2 years ahead or 5 years ahead, but enough of it to know the next step, and the step after that, and to have reasonable confidence that the steps existed even when I could not yet see them. The fellowship review in the second term brought me into contact with other researchers working on similar questions, not the specific question of Resolution 7 Delta, but related questions about the completeness and accuracy of Council historical records for recently catalogued species. Some of them were Cathari, some were Valorian. One was Rendasi, a younger colleague of Oswell's from the main library branch, who had been working on a separate restricted classification issue for 6 years, and who, when I explained my own situation, looked at me with the particular relief of someone who has been working alone on something for a long time and has just discovered they are not alone after all. We began sharing methodology, then sourcing frameworks, then, gradually, the kind of intellectual trust that develops between people doing closely related difficult work, where you can say I am not certain about this, and have the uncertainty received as information rather than weakness. The network grew slowly, as networks of this kind tend to grow, not by announcement, not by formal structure, but by the incremental accumulation of people who found each other through the work and recognized what they had in common. Drayle came to the archive once, about 4 months after the assessment, and asked Oswell if he could review some of the restricted materials relating to the human record. He asked formally, correctly, with a faculty authorization request that satisfied every requirement of the regulation. Oswell authorized the access without comment. He spent 3 sessions in the restricted reading room with the materials. When he finished, he found me in the corridor outside the library and said, "The assessment framework score for long-range planning across leadership transitions, based on the full record, is considerably higher than I had understood." "Yes," I said. "The secondary sourcing in the publicly available record," he said, "traces back to a primary document that was classified in the second year of Resolution 7 Delta. The available secondary source does not convey the primary document's conclusions accurately. It conveys a portion of those conclusions and omits the portions that produce the higher score." "Yes," I said. He was quiet for a moment. "I have been teaching from the secondary source for 40 years, he said. "I have taught several hundred cadets from the secondary source. In every case, those cadets left my course with an understanding of human strategic capacity that was incorrect by a significant margin." I looked at him. He was not looking for absolution, and I was not in a position to offer it. What he was doing was stating a fact with the precision of a man who holds himself to a standard of accuracy and has just discovered a significant failure against it. That kind of honesty requires a particular kind of courage, and I recognized it, and I thought it was worth recognizing. "The course materials are being updated," I said. "Yes," he said. "I am updating them myself. I wanted you to know." "I know," I said. "Thank you." He nodded and walked back toward the faculty wing, and I stood in the corridor for a moment and thought about what it meant to be the kind of person who, when they discover they have been wrong for 40 years, decides to correct it rather than defend it. The galaxy had more of those people than I had expected when I first stepped off the shuttle ramp. Not enough, but more. 8 months after the assessment, the Restoration and Audit Division issued its preliminary finding on Resolution 7 Delta. The finding was not the final determination. That still required a full council review period with formal comment from the original administrative species, a process that would take additional months. But the preliminary finding recommended full declassification of the restricted materials and their integration into the public record, with a notation acknowledging that the original restriction had been applied beyond its stated justification. The notation was careful and formal, and bureaucratic in the way of documents produced by bodies that are not in the habit of describing their own institutional failings with any more clarity than absolutely required. But it said what it said, and what it said was that the restriction had been wrong, and that the data should have been available, and that the published assessments derived from incomplete data should be reviewed. I read the document in the restricted reading room with Osvel sitting across from me, both of us reading in silence. When I finished, I looked at her. 18 months, they said. I said. 8 months, she said. You submitted supplementary materials to the division, I said. It was not a question. I have 314 years of archive records, she said. I also have quite a thorough understanding of which supplementary materials tend to accelerate a divisional review, and which tend to complicate it. She picked up one of her data chips and turned it between her fingers. I chose carefully. I looked at her for a moment. Then I picked up my notebook and opened it to the first page and read the 5 lines. Why? Not if I can help it. 6 weeks. They know now. We are just starting. I looked at the lines for a while. They were still true. All of them, still true, including the last one, which I now understood better than I had when I wrote it. The starting was still happening. It would keep happening. That was the nature of it. I closed the notebook. I put it in my bag. I looked at Osvel, who was already turning back to her work, with the serene focus of a person for whom the work itself is the point, and the outcomes are simply what the work produces. What is next? I asked. The formal comment period opens in 30 days, she said. We submit formal research contributions, together, I think, given that the combined weight of a fellowship recipient's formal analysis and an archivist's supplementary documentation will be more difficult to set aside than either one separately. Agreed, I said. After the comment period, the full council review, approximately 4 months, possibly 6. And then? Then, she said, the restriction is lifted. The materials enter the public database. Every institution using council records updates its holdings. The tier charts are reviewed. The course materials are corrected. She looked at me over the top of the document she had returned to. And then the work that comes after that, which there will be. I know, I said. Good, she said. I sat in the restricted reading room for a while longer, in the quiet and the preserved air, and the particular stillness of a place where important things have been kept carefully for a very long time. Then I gathered my materials, organized my notes, and stood up. I said goodnight to Osvel, who nodded without looking up from her work in the way of someone who is already 4 pages further into the task. I walked out of the archive, through the library wing, up to the observation corridor with its long curved wall, and the stars beyond it. I stood at the window. The same stars as always, unchanged, indifferent, very clear. I thought about my father standing in the kitchen. Do not let them make you small. I had not. I would not. And I was going to spend a very long time making sure that not being made small was not a thing that only one person had to fight for. The door was open now. Not wide open. The door was the kind of door that required continued effort to stay open, the kind that had been closed for 200 years and had developed the habit of closing, but open enough that what was on the other side was visible, and what was visible could be reached, and what could be reached could be used. I looked at the stars for 1 more minute. Then I turned and walked back into the station, back toward the work, carrying my notebook and my 5 lines, and the particular certainty of someone who knows exactly what they are doing and exactly why, and who has no intention whatsoever of stopping.